They shaved a single dad's head for fun, until his Mafia boss father walked in. The first clump of hair hit the cold tile floor like something dying, and in that moment, everyone laughed except the man sitting in the chair. The buzzing machine hummed against his scalp, stripping away more than hair, peeling dignity down to bare skin, and the mirrors reflected a single dad who had learned to stay silent because silence was cheaper than pride. He stared at his reflection, eyes hollow but steady, while hands he didn't know pushed his head forward again, forcing the joke to continue. No one noticed how his hands trembled, not from fear, but from the memory of promises he was still trying to keep. If you believe stories like this matter, if you believe kindness, second chances, and unseen strength still exist in this world, take a moment right now to like this video, share it with someone who needs hope, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach the hearts they're meant for. His name was Marco DeLuca, and he had not always been invisible. Years ago, his name carried weight, a last name that opened doors and closed mouths, but Marco had walked away from all of it the night his wife died giving birth to their son. He chose diapers over danger, school lunches over blood debts, a quiet life over a loud legacy soaked in violence. He moved cities, changed jobs, and learned how to survive as a nobody. Being a single father meant waking up before dawn, packing lunches with handwritten notes, and working double shifts just to keep the lights on. It also meant swallowing humiliation when it came, because his son needed stability more than his father needed pride. The barbershop was supposed to be a cheap cut before his second job. He had walked in with his jacket frayed at the elbows, eyes tired from sleepless nights, and the hope that this would be quick and painless. But the shop had been busy, loud with laughter and arrogance, filled with men who mistook cruelty for humor. Someone recognized his worn clothes, his quiet voice, the way he kept his eyes down, and decided he would be entertainment. It started with jokes, then teasing, then hands on his shoulders holding him down as the clippers turned from trimming to punishment. Marco didn't fight back. He thought of his son's face, how scared the boy looked when he raised his voice even slightly. He thought of the promise he made at a grave under rain-soaked earth, that he would never let violence touch their lives again. So he sat still while laughter bounced off the walls, while his reflection became unfamiliar, while his past whispered that once, no one would have dared touch him like this. But that life was buried, and this one demanded endurance. When they finally let him go, his scalp burned with cold air and shame. His hair lay scattered like proof of weakness. The men laughed harder, taking photos, already planning how to share the moment online. Marco stood slowly, adjusting his jacket, refusing to let them see him break. He paid with money he had saved for groceries, nodded once, and walked out into the street where the city moved on without noticing him. He didn't know that across town, a different kind of storm was already in motion. That same afternoon, a black convoy rolled silently through traffic, engines purring with restrained power. Inside the lead car sat Antonio DeLuca, a man whose name was spoken carefully even decades after he tried to disappear. Age had carved lines into his face, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, carrying the weight of 1,000 decisions that shaped lives and ended others. He had built an empire from nothing, lost a son to defiance, and now lived with the one regret that money could not erase. Years ago, Marco had walked away from him, choosing a life Antonio could never understand. They hadn't spoken since the funeral of Marco's wife, where grief and blame hung heavier than rain. Antonio had tracked his son quietly, from a distance, respecting the boundary even when it hurt. But that morning, a message reached him from one of his old associates, a simple warning that Marco was being humiliated publicly, his image spreading fast among the wrong people. Antonio felt something crack inside him then, a mix of rage and guilt, because no matter how far Marco ran, the world would never stop testing him. Marco returned home that evening with a hat pulled low. His son, little Luca, noticed immediately. The boy's smile faded, replaced by concern far too old for his age. Marco brushed it off, pretending it was a bad haircut, turning it into a joke so his son wouldn't worry. They ate dinner together, laughed softly, and Marco waited until Luca fell asleep before sitting alone in the dark, hat in his hands, wondering how much more he could take without becoming someone he didn't want to be. The next day, the video exploded online. Views climbed, comments sharpened, cruelty multiplied. At work, Marco felt eyes on him, whispers trailing behind. He focused on his tasks, reminding himself that this job paid rent, that pride didn't feed children. But by afternoon, his manager called him in, awkwardly explaining that the attention was bad for business and that it might be best if Marco took some time off. Time off without pay. Marco nodded again, thanked him, and left with his box of belongings, the weight of uncertainty pressing on his chest. That was when the black cars pulled up outside the barbershop. The street fell quiet as doors opened in perfect unison. Men in tailored suits stepped out, their presence heavy, deliberate, commanding attention without words. Antonio De Luca emerged last, cane tapping softly against the pavement, his gaze fixed on the shop where his son's dignity had been stripped for entertainment. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He simply walked in, and the air changed. Inside, the laughter died instantly. The men who had mocked Marco felt something primal awaken in their chests, a warning they didn't fully understand. Antonio surveyed the room slowly, taking in the clippers, the mirrors, the nervous faces. He saw his son's hair still on the floor, swept into a corner like trash, and something dark passed behind his eyes. Antonio didn't need to raise his voice. His presence spoke for him, a reminder of consequences long forgotten. He made it clear, calmly, precisely, that humiliation was a debt, and debts in his world were always paid. He didn't threaten violence, he didn't have to. Fear filled the room on its own. The men who thought they were powerful suddenly felt very small, realizing too late that the man they hurt carried a name that could still bend the city. But Antonio didn't stop there. He ordered his men to clean the shop, to erase the evidence, to make amends publicly. Donations were made to charities for single parents. Apologies were issued, faces pale and voices shaking. The video was taken down, replaced by statements of remorse. And when Antonio left, the barbershop stood silent, changed forever by the weight of accountability. Marco found out that evening when Antonio stood at his door, older, heavier, but unmistakably his father. The reunion was tense, layered with years of unspoken pain. Antonio didn't excuse himself. He didn't justify his past. He simply told Marco that no matter how far he ran, he would never stop being his son, and no one had the right to humiliate him. Marco felt anger, gratitude, and grief collide inside him. He had worked so hard to build a quiet life, to escape the shadow of violence, and yet that shadow had stepped in when he was at his weakest. But he also understood that his father's actions weren't about power, they were about protection, the kind that came too late too often. Over the following weeks, things began to change. Marco was offered a better job, not because of fear, but because people finally saw his resilience. The community rallied around him, inspired by his quiet strength and the story behind it. Donations helped him stabilize, but more importantly, respect followed him wherever he went. He still wore his hair short, a reminder of where he'd been, but now he walked taller. Antonio stepped back again, keeping his distance, honoring Marco's boundaries. He watched his son from afar, pride and regret sharing space in his chest. Marco, in turn, allowed himself to accept help without shame, understanding that strength didn't mean standing alone. Near the end of this story, if it has touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel. Your engagement helps keep stories like this alive. And before this story ends, I have a special request for you. Please comment below with a single word that describes how this story made you feel. Your words matter more than you know. One evening, Marco walked Luca to the park, the sun setting in warm colors that softened the world. His son laughed freely, unaware of the darkness his father had shielded him from. Marco watched him run, realizing that every humiliation endured, every silent tear swallowed, had been worth it. He hadn't needed fists or fear to protect his family. He had chosen love, patience, and dignity, and in the end, that choice reshaped his fate. The world can be cruel, but sometimes, when strength meets compassion, even the deepest wounds can become proof of survival. And that is a power no one can ever shave away.